Hello listeners, this talk is about Donald Trump. I'm sure many of you have been wondering what I think of Donald Trump, but someone by the username of Robotic Ponies, and then in parentheses Coconutshake, I'm not sure to what extent the Coconutshake modifies the Robotic Ponies, but nevertheless it's an interesting username. He asked me about my thoughts regarding the Donald. So here we go. Because I do have many thoughts, and many of them are a little bit crazy about the Donald. Some of you may already know what I'm going to say, but nevertheless, I'm going to say it anyway. So, firstly, what do I think about Donald Trump personally? Because he is he's an interesting character in and of himself. I think he's into self-promotion, though I'm not quite sure what the end game would be if this presidential run were purely about self-promotion. I mean, I don't know if he's going to try to sell a book afterwards. I can't see how that would work for him, to be honest. So I think he's probably serious. I think he's probably genuine. Who knows, though, because he's a rather enigmatic figure. I think Donald Trump is very much into Donald Trump. That said, I do like that he is trolling the establishment and liberals and conservatives really hard. I love it every time they moan about the latest thing that he said. It's entertaining, if nothing else. That said, the fact that this is what civil discourse has become, that a lot of people, because I know I'm not alone, either want a troll or to basically tell the establishment to get lost, or they just want the entertainment factor every time he says something crazy. I think the fact that a lot of people think like this is a sign that society is not very healthy. Not just the US, but the US is sort of the leader of the pack in the West, and we're all in the same boat, to sort of mix metaphors. I think this is a sign that the West is in real trouble. It's a society rapidly disintegrating, when many people now just see politics purely as revenge porn or just as porn. It's troubling. Nevertheless, I'm going to talk about what I think about his chances of winning and all of this sort of stuff, whether I think it would be good or bad, all that sort of stuff. So the way I see it, there are 5 possible scenarios, and I've given each a number for easy reference. So the first scenario 1.1, is where he gets the nomination to be the Republican candidate and he wins the presidency in the general election, most likely against Hillary Clinton. Scenario 1.2 is where he gets the nomination but he loses to Hillary Clinton at the general election. Then scenario 2.1 is where he has the numbers, he's the front runner for the Republicans, but he gets snubbed somehow. He gets cheated out of the nomination, and he runs as an independent as a result. Scenario 2.2 is where he has the numbers, he gets snubbed, but he doesn't run as an independent, and he essentially disappears. And then scenario 3 is where he doesn't have the numbers to be the Republican candidate. I think it's unlikely in that scenario that he would then run as an independent anyway, but maybe he would. I don't know. So what I'm going to do is run through these in reverse order, and I'll be largely descriptive here. I'll analyze them and talk about what I would prefer and so on after I just sort of state what I think would happen under each scenario. So let's look in reverse order. Scenario 3, so this is the one where he doesn't have the numbers. For some reason, he is not the front runner, he doesn't do well in the primaries and so on and so forth. Someone else emerges. And I don't know who that would be. I'm not following the other people, to be honest. I don't really care about them. So this is the scenario that those on the left as well as many people within the Republican Party, both the leadership and to some extent some other conservatives. This is the scenario that a lot of people are really hoping for, and it's a scenario under which they would breathe a huge sigh of relief. They're essentially hoping for this miracle, that Trump naturally falls away and then just goes away. You know, he might fire a few parting shots and then they'll say, oh, sour grapes, you know, and he'll disappear. There would be a few results from this. I mean, I think regardless of what Donald Trump ends up doing, to some extent, the Overton window will have been expanded to the right. I say expanded, not shifted, because there will still be crazy ideas on the left. It's just that the window will get bigger. So its leftmost edge will be in the same position, basically, or it'll probably go even farther to the left because of all these crazies this year who will only get worse next year and so on. But basically, the window will not move from its current position on the left, or it will go a little bit more in that direction. But what is acceptable at the farthest right point will move. And that will be semi-permanent, I think. It's hard to say exactly how much of that will remain or would remain if Donald Trump just disappeared quietly off the scene. But I think a lot of things that were not permissible to talk about or to say even a year ago are now very much on the table. So that will be one result, even if he disappears. I don't think it will do too much, though, because I think the Republicans might make some overtures to try to recapture Donald Trump's supporters. But they would basically run the cardboard cutout conservative. You know, they're Mitt Romney look-alike, you know, all the usual, right? Who wouldn't really do very much and would just, at best, slow the decline, at worst, allow the leftists to continue, but would not turn anything around. And I think that person would be unelectable, actually. I think large numbers of people who would support Donald Trump would not support that guy. And Hillary Clinton would win at the general election. I think if Donald Trump just disappears, a lot of the rank and file on the right would become extremely disillusioned with the political process. Some would come over to the alt-right. I think the alt-right would continue to grow and strengthen. But all of this, you know, people not turning up to vote and people going over to the right, the alt-right, would be interpreted as sour grapes by the media and the left in general, despite the fact that the Cathedral have been running a very concerted campaign against Trump, or not just against Trump, but against Western civilization for a long time. But you know, the number of people who actually know what the Cathedral is and how it operates, that number is vanishingly small, actually. Most people, they don't get the idea of the Cathedral. They don't know what that is. So the left would be able to run that narrative that it was all sour grapes and so on. And I think most people would admit that the scenario 3 would not be a very good scenario, but I'll go into that a little bit more later. So the next scenario is 2.2, and this is the one where Donald Trump would have the numbers, but he would get snubbed by the leadership of the Republican Party. But he wouldn't. I mean, he might fire a few parting shots, but he would essentially go away. So it's kind of a variation on 3, but where he had more popularity, where he would have more popularity. I think the other thing too is that because he would be snubbed despite having the numbers, he could be seen as a martyred figure, and the alt-right could tap into that as well. The next scenario is 2.1. This is the scenario where he would have the numbers, and again he would get snubbed by the leadership of the Republican Party. And so he would say, right, well, screw you, I'm going to run as an independent. Now, obviously, the vote on the right would be split and Hillary would win. the conservatives and their handlers would cry buckets of tears and throw tantrums about how Trump threw the election to her, and the Antichrist had arrived, and all of this sort of stuff, right? And for that reason alone, it would be quite amusing to see this eventuate. But I'm actually going to talk a lot about this later. Scenario 1.2. This is the scenario where he got the candidacy. The Republican leadership were too terrified not to give it to him because they wouldn't want him to run as an independent. But he lost, or would lose, to Hillary in the election. Now, I actually don't know whether he could win or not. I think polls are likely to be highly unreliable. I suspect that a lot of people wouldn't tell pollsters or anyone else the truth. And there might be some who would secretly vote for Trump. They wouldn't be able to tell their friends or family or colleagues or something, because if they're at work, someone might be saying, "Oh, Donald Trump, that guy, oh, he's horrible," and they might have to nod along and say, "Oh, yeah, he's terrible." But secretly, they might vote for him anyway. It's just that they couldn't tell anyone because of the social ramifications and so on. So he might be able to pull off a big surprise, but I tend to suspect that it's more likely that he would lose still, because there would be enough of a coalition of minorities, women, because a lot of women, despite anything else they might think about Hillary, she's a woman, and a lot of women would not be able to help themselves. They would have to vote for the first female president ever. So women, and also a lot of white cucks. I mean, there are a lot of white cucks who are Democrats, but there are also tons of conservatives within the Republican Party and so on, who just wouldn't be able to bear the fact that Adolf Hitler could be elected. We just have to vote for Hillary. We don't like her, but at least she's not Adolf Hitler. And they would all conspire to lock him out, right? I think that's actually quite likely. So again, we're back at the scenario where Hillary would win. And now we get to scenario 1.1. This is the scenario where he would go all the way and become the president. I don't think he would get anything done, personally. I think the cathedral would pull out all the stops and they would block him at every single juncture. Every petty bureaucrat, right up to Supreme Court judges, every single person in the cathedral would oppose him. They would throw sand in the gears. They would put sugar in the petrol tank and so on. I mean, just think of things like sanctuary cities, for instance. There are already laws on the books about immigration, and there are a number of people blatantly ignoring those laws already in various government departments. I mean, teachers a lot of teachers are really left-wing, and those who aren't keep their mouths shut. But how is he going to deport illegal immigrants? Because imagine there's a teacher and there's a kid in that teacher's class, or multiple kids in that teacher's class, who are illegal immigrants, and the teacher knows it. The teacher's not going to ring up immigration services and say, little Pedro Martinez and his family are illegal. Come and, take this 8-year-old kid out of my class right now. It's not going to happen. All of these bureaucrats in the government would just make it so that anything he tried to do would be death by 1,000 cuts. They would say, all right, there's more than one way to skin a cat here. We're just going to stop you one step at a time. That's what they would do. So I don't think he would accomplish very much. But let's say that he could. Let's say that he could deport all 11 million or more illegal immigrants. The problem now is that wouldn't be enough. The birth rate in the US is such that under 50% of babies are white. And we know that black kids who grow up, brown kids who grow up, they're all overwhelmingly going to vote left-wing, and a certain percentage of white kids are. So mathematically, it seems that all this would do would be to delay the inevitable, rather than the demographic tipping point occurring at, I don't know, 2030. It would just occur at 2040 or something like that. It wouldn't go far enough to actually solve the problem. That's the thing that a lot of people in America don't realize now. They're past the tipping point already. Even if not one more illegal immigrant crosses that border, America's past the tipping point because of the birth rate. And not just on that issue, but on every single issue, the things that Trump would really need to do to turn America around, to make it great again and all of that stuff, he would not want to do, and he wouldn't be able to do, because they're not within the Overton window. And I know a lot of people might say, well, 6 months ago or 12 months ago, the Overton window was different. But the problem is not illegal immigrants from Mexico or Guatemala or wherever. Those sorts of issues are merely symptoms of a much deeper problem. Pardon me. They're only symptoms. The root of the problem goes much deeper than that. If it were only that, it would be easy to solve. But the root of the problem is actually many things. It's white and Jewish professors and journalists and teachers and judges and so on, all of the people who work in the public sector and many who work in the private sector as well, who enable them. It's the Republican Party. It's white businessmen who want cheap labor. It's even consumers who want cheap goods. Donald Trump is not going to be able to shut down the New York Times or tell them what they can and can't write in their newspapers. He's not going to be able to go into schools all across the nation and tell them what they can and can't do. He's not going to be able to go and clean house in every anthropology department or sociology department at a university. He's not going to be able to do that. He might be able to take on some people. He might be able to take on some business leaders. He might be able to take on a few of these people. But there are so many of them, and he needs them to run the country. It's not like he could just fire them all immediately and just replace them overnight. He couldn't do that. And as long as they stay in those jobs, they will always, or would always, just quietly, slowly subvert him. Just a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. Death by 1,000 cuts. He might be able to do some things, but overall he wouldn't be able to accomplish very much. And as I mentioned, another factor in all of this is consumers. They want cheap goods. Okay, they don't want illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants are stealing their jobs. Would they go and work in the fields for below minimum wage, picking fruit and vegetables? I think many wouldn't. So they want cheap fruit and vegetables. Where are they going to get them from? Would they go and work in a factory for what someone in China works in a factory for? Well, they still want cheap consumer goods from China. Unless they're willing to do these things, how do they square that circle then of getting rid of illegal immigration or putting up trade barriers and all of this stuff? How do they do that and still have cheap goods? Now, you could say, well, they would earn more so they could afford more, maybe. I'm not entirely sure I buy that argument. I just don't think he would do what would be necessary anyway. I think those things are just off the table. He would never be able to do those things. As I said, it would be death by 1,000 cuts. I don't even know if he truly recognizes the depth of this problem. Not many people do. Those of us who know what the cathedral is and how it works, we're a very, very small minority of people. And the average person out there, they might say, yeah, get rid of the illegal immigrants. They're not going to get rid of people who were given amnesty 20 years ago, or their parents, or whomever. People who are Hispanic but who have been in the US for 3 generations. They're not going to say get rid of those people. And unless they get rid of those kinds of people, as I said, the birth rate is just, at some point, it's just going to be an inevitability what happens. They're not going to go far enough with any of these things. They would never support him with this, and they talk about an attack on civil liberties and so on. This is all despite leftists attacking civil liberties at universities and so on and so forth. But hypocrisy is the main thing they sell, right? And that's never stopped them before. But I just don't think he'd be able to get past this. The average American is just far too cucked, at least right now. Things might be different in a few years, but at least right now, the average American is far too cucked to ever let someone do what would be necessary. And as I said, I don't think Donald Trump would necessarily even be aware of what would be necessary or would even want to do what would be necessary. So I more or less think that a Donald Trump presidency would be a non-starter, essentially. And look, this could be a good thing because it would show people on the right that if they win, they're still not allowed to win. You might have the most points on the board at the end of the day, at the end of the match, but you don't walk home with the trophy. It could very well hasten the demise of democracy, and I'm not very enamored with democracy, so I think that would be a good thing. And if you doubt this, I'll give you two examples. The first one is look at the French regional elections that took place yesterday, or the second round of them. So a week ago when they had their first round, or 8 days ago when they had their first round, the National Front, and everyone, or a lot of people on the alt-right love Marine Le Pen and the National Front and so on. They see her as the new Charles Martel or something, right? And I mean, she's not really, but nevertheless, they see her as a potential savior, right? So 8 days ago, they were leading in about half of the regions in France, and in at least one case, they had 40% of the vote. Now, the French system is a little bit strange, and they have a runoff, basically. And the socialists actually withdrew their candidates and told their supporters to vote for the Republicans, the centre-right party, purely to block the National Front. So rather than keep a candidate in there and risk the National Front sneaking over the line, they actually voted for people they didn't like as the lesser of two evils, right? It was a complete farce, right? But the upshot of it was that the National Front came away with nothing. They didn't win a single region in France as a result of this. Or they didn't when I checked earlier today. I don't know, maybe things have turned around or something. Maybe someone found some extra ballots somewhere. And the most striking example of this was Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who is the niece of Marine Le Pen, the head of the party. In the first round 8 days ago, she had 40% of the vote. After all of these tactical voting games were played, she had 44% of the vote in the second round. So it went from, I think there were at least 3 candidates, and she had 40% of the vote there, right? So well over a third. When it went down to 2 candidates, she only picked up an additional 4%. She wasn't allowed to win. That's how it works. That's how the system works. You're not allowed to win. And if somehow she and the others had got in, again, they just would have been blocked at every juncture. Likewise, another example, Nigel Farage. I remember earlier this year, everyone was he was the great white hope earlier this year, and he's not even really that right. I mean, he has this crazy idea that it's bad to have Polish people in the UK because they're not from the Anglosphere, but it's better to have someone from Pakistan or Ghana or something because they're part of the Commonwealth. What the hell is that, right? But nevertheless, Nigel Farage was this great white hope, and again, tactical voting, and he didn't get elected to the seat for which he was running. You're not allowed to vote. You're not allowed to win in electoral politics if you're on the far right. And I think that many people in the West need to see this. I think some who supported UKIP previously may have finally swallowed this bitter pill and abandoned electoral politics. I think many who support the National Front will also do so. Although I think probably with the National Front, that people will still hope that somehow Marine Le Pen will win in 2017. But nevertheless, I think right now in Europe there are quite a few people who are taking a pretty good hard look at themselves and what they believe in and their faith in the system. Americans are not at that point yet. They still have the great white hope. But I think Trump supporters need to go through this process at some point. One way or another, whether it's because he gets locked out from even getting the candidacy, or whether he goes all the way and then gets locked out from actually implementing anything because every petty bureaucrat just throws sand in the gears. One way or another, Trump supporters need to go through this process and abandon faith in the electoral process. I think that in the next decade or two, there are only going to be two options. There will be the far left, because leftists are just getting crazier and crazier. I mean, look at all the nonsense that's happened this year. There's too much to mention, but I'll just say three things, or four things. Gay marriage, Bruce Jenner, the Confederate flag, and Black Lives Matter, right? Just look at those four things. And there are tons of others as well. Leftists are getting crazier, and they're eating their own and so on. I mean, they're eating white professors who have allowed this to come to fruition, but now they're turning on them. Is nothing sacred? You're going after, some white cultural Marxist. Is nothing sacred? But the far left is getting crazier and crazier, so that's going to be one option. And as a result of them being crazier and crazier, the only other option is going to be the far right. Conservatives are going to disappear. Your sort of average small L liberal, they're going to disappear as well. And eventually this is going to manifest itself in both sides drawing up their battle lines, essentially. I think there's going to be conflict. There's no nice ending here. I don't think this gets solved according to the old rules of the game where, okay, you guys get a turn for a few years, then we get a turn for a few years, then you get a turn, we get a turn. And it's sometimes it gets a bit heated, but it's fairly amicable, and we're just playing a game here, right? It's not like that anymore. There's no nice ending here. Trump is not the knight in shining armor on a white horse. He's not. On the other hand, the Republicans might push the line in 2020 that Trump has been a disaster because he was too extreme, and so a more mainstream Republican who is willing to work with the Democrats and compromise, in other words, cave into them, would be better. In other words, a conservative would be required. And they might push that line and say, you can't have another 4 years of Trump. Everything's out of control. We would know whose fault that would actually be, but a lot of people would probably be too naive still, and they would fall for that, and they would say, yeah, all right, yeah, Trump has been really divisive, we should get rid of him, and we should put in a cardboard cutout conservative instead. I think that would be a disaster, because I think the alt-right would be worse off than where we are now. Actually, I think that would be worse than him never being elected. Because 4 years from now, 8 years from now, the demographics, the state of institutions, the culture, economics, all of these things will be a little bit worse. And that's not going to bode well, really. I think the alt-right... Oh, sorry, I just want to add to that previous point. I think that won't be good because I do believe that conflict is inevitable, and I think that the longer it takes for that to eventuate, the worse it's going to be for the right. So things need to come to a head as soon as possible. The alt-right by then would have lost a lot of momentum, because the alt-right is a revolutionary movement. And revolutionary movements that are only partly successful ultimately fail and then self-destruct. Revolutionary movements either need to be able to get into power and implement their full raft of ideas to truly be successful. And there aren't that many revolutions that have been really ultimately successful in the long term and so on. But nevertheless, they need to be able to do their whole thing. They can't do it in part. It usually doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense if they do it in part. Or they need to be able to position themselves as outsiders who are locked out of power by conspiracy and so on. So I think that Trump getting into power would actually be bad, because it would undermine all of that. The other problem with the Trump presidency that didn't achieve anything, and of course, we know what that would be, because he would be blocked at every level and juncture by the left, is that it would likely give a huge boost to the revolutionary left, but in the wrong way, because then they would be seen as saviors, and they could implement all sorts of crazy socialism and so on. Now, I do actually think that would be good, except that the alt-right is on borrowed time, because if the alt-right were to get in, if Donald Trump was seen as the savior and he got in, but he didn't do what was necessary, the left would be able to capitalize upon that, and I think the alt-right would be out in the wilderness for at least a decade or so. I think lots of people would lose faith in it, and they would be out in the wilderness and disorganized and so on for a decade or so. And by then, due to demographic changes, it would be game over. Unless there could be a small insurgency or something, a military coup or something, I don't think the alt-right would stand a chance at that point in the future. The other thing to consider here is that I think there's a high likelihood of an economic crisis occurring within the next few years. I mean, people have been saying that for a while. If you ever look at Peter Schiff, he's one of these guys who he says it's coming next Tuesday kind of thing, right? But nevertheless, I think that the economic situation in the world is becoming more and more untenable. There are many, many fault lines, and everything's interconnected. And I think that something is likely to happen within the next few years. I mean, there's a recession every 7 years on average, and we're 7 years after the last one, or at least after the last one began. And I don't think Donald Trump or the alt-right in general should be the ones saddled with that. This is basically like a game of pass the parcel, except the parcel is a time bomb. And you don't want to be the last one holding the time bomb, essentially. So whoever gets left holding the bag when the next economic crisis hits is even if they handle it as well as they could, it's still going to be bad for them. And so the left should own that, especially because the left have been the ones sowing all of the seeds for this. They should own that when the crisis hits. And that would be, I mean, no one wants an economic crisis, obviously, but that would be beneficial to the alt-right, because if the left, if the world had all of these leftists or conservatives in power for many years, but especially leftists, and particularly in the US, if they had 8 years of Obama and then 3 years into a Hillary presidency, the crisis hits, or 4 years or 5 years or whatever, they would be left holding the bag. And this would be a little bit like the 1930s all over again. It would be very beneficial to the alt-right if the left were holding the bag when it all hit the fan, to mix my metaphors. All of this is a long way of saying that I think Donald Trump is the wrong person at the wrong time. I think he's premature, essentially. America is not ready for him, as much as many people might think that they are. America and Americans are not ready for him. I think things need to get a lot worse so that one of two things will happen. I think either the Overton window will need to shift enough such that someone who is really on the right, truly on the right, someone who makes Donald Trump look like small potatoes, such that that person could sweep into power with public opinion behind him. And I know lots of people on the alt-right don't like populism and all of this sort of stuff. And I might make another talk about this, but I don't either to a certain extent. But I think that's the epoch in which we live, and I think we need to sort of accept that that's how things work, and we need to make the most of that bad situation. So maybe things could get worse, such that the real deal could arrive after Donald Trump. But he's sort of the John the Baptist figure. He's not the real deal, right? He's sort of he's the precursor, if you like. Or I think there needs to be a revolution in response to Hillary and Obama. 16 years of that craziness, and it would be crazy. That's actually my preferred option because, as I said, I'm not such a fan of democracy and so on. But things need to get a lot worse before they will get better. And in that regard, I am an accelerationist. I think find the worst person who can do the most harm and put them in power just to bring it all to a head as soon as possible. And I think Hillary would be an absolute godsend for the right. She would be atrocious. I mean, I don't imagine that she would be anything but atrocious. But think of how many people have come over to the alt-right because of Obama. Think of, many of you. I know of at least one person, and he has his own channel, who voted for Obama in 2008. And he's now a right-wing edgelord. Think of how many people have come over because of 8 years of Obama. Imagine 8 more years of that. It would be crazy, it would be painful, it would be absolutely insane. I don't know what, the stuff that's happened this year, it seems bizarre. Bruce Jenner won Woman of the Year for Vanity Fair or whatever it was, it's bizarre, right? It's really bizarre. If you had told anyone this kind of stuff a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years ago, they would have thought you were raving mad. And yet here we are. It's the current year, don't you know? Who knows what crazy stuff they have in store. But, bring it on, right? It needs to get worse. People need another 8 years of that. Think of all the people who had to get hope and change so good and hard. These were liberals, young liberals, who hit all the talking points, all the usual leftist talking points, but they got hope and change so hard that they were forced to become alt-right edgelords. And there are a number of them, because the alt-right, I don't know what the numbers are, but I imagine probably 50% of the people in the alt-right were like that before, or they were sort of half asleep, politically at least. But they got it so hard that it woke them up. Think of 16 years of this craziness, a whole generation of young white men, completely disenfranchised. Young white men, all that energy, all that intellect, all that that desire to do something. Imagine that, disenfranchised, aggrieved and aggravated. They would be a force to behold. I think Hillary would be precisely the person to wake that up and push all of them completely over the edge. So I want Hillary to win. I think she is what America and the world needs and what they should get. But under which of the above options would I like to see her come to power? Well, my preferred option is 2.1, that Trump has the numbers, but he gets denied the candidacy by the Republicans and he runs as an independent. Because I think then that he, and by extension the alt-right, could be martyred. They could be victims of a conspiracy. The GOP's mask in this good cop, bad cop routine that they play with the Democrats where they pretend that they're actually on the side of the average white male in the US. That mask needs to come off, and it would. If they openly blocked Trump from the candidacy, people would finally see, I think a large number of people would finally see the GOP for what they actually are, that they have complete disdain for the rank and file, for the average American. And the other thing is that because he would no longer be sort of somewhat trying to keep people on side, he would be going purely for himself, and he would know that he wouldn't be able to get enough to beat Hillary. He would split the vote. He would know that. The gloves would come off, and he could absolutely go to town on the cardboard cutout conservative. It would be something absolutely awesome to behold. Those presidential debates. I mean, Hillary might just shut up and let Trump absolutely tear shreds off the cardboard cutout and let those two just bloody each other to a pulp. But it would be absolutely awesome to behold him take the gloves off and just tell everyone what they are, and call it, and that as well would red pill a whole bunch of people. Now, I think many on the left would foolishly love to see Trump go head to head with the conservative candidate and split the vote. Because they're too stupid to realise what the ramifications of that would be. They're too stupid to realise that would destroy the GOP. I mean, they want to see the GOP destroyed. You see all these comments online that, we want to see the GOP finally revealed as the fascists that they are. And we want to see the GOP destroyed. They will rue the day that ever happens, though, because if the GOP gets destroyed, then that's it. All bets are off at that point, and I think that the right could truly rise. And the GOP absolutely needs to be destroyed. It is the single biggest problem. It's one of many problems, but it is the single biggest problem in the whole process, in the whole society at the moment. And the same goes for other conservative parties in other countries. I mean, the Conservatives in the UK, the Liberals in Australia, and so on. They all need to be destroyed, essentially. Now, my next preferred option would be 2.2. So this is the option where Trump would have the numbers and he would get denied, but he would bow out. And it would just be Hillary versus the cutout, right? The cardboard cutout conservative. Because this would largely allow the alt-right to remain unscathed. They could still look like martyrs. They could look like victims of a conspiracy, but no one could really accuse them of sour grapes. And so I think that would buy into the alt-right's narrative of being victims and being locked out. And again, I think that could still destroy the GOP, actually. It would probably have largely the same effect as Trump being an independent. I suspect, though, that 2.2 is off the table due to a combination of Trump's personality. I mean, I think if he were at the head of the pack by the end of primary season, and if he were snubbed, I don't think he would go out gracefully. I think he would run as an independent. And also because I think the GOP would be too intimidated at that prospect. I think they would be very worried, and they would probably give him the candidacy, even though they wouldn't really want him to do it, simply because they would know that if he ran as an independent, Hillary would get in, and they'd hate that. Or they might think that they could somehow bring him in line, and so on and so forth, right? They might say, all right, well, we can work on him, we'll get him under control. But there are some people, I think, at the top, and even some lower-ranking conservatives who would still like to see him lose because he's Hitler, right? But I think they would be in the minority. I think most people would still want the Republicans to win, and they're fed up with Obama and they fear Hillary. So I think the GOP leadership would not snub him if he were at the front. I think they'd be too scared that there'd be revolt from below, and that he would run as an independent. That said, if it did actually happen, if he just bowed out gracefully, it would be sad because it would be an end to the Trump troll tour and all of its ensuing hilarity, and we'd be back to the usual boring Hillary versus the cardboard cutout conservative. It would just be Obama versus Romney all over again, right? And no one wants that. That's dumb. All right, so my next preferred option would be 1.2, where he received the candidacy but he lost to Hillary. I don't think this is a particularly good option, basically because then leftists could say that Hillary actually beat Trump and his supporters and those ideas in a fair fight. And I think they would, to some extent, they would have a point, although of course, the cathedral would be a large part of that, right? But again, most people don't know what the cathedral is, right? So I think they would be able to get away with that point. And I think it would possibly lead to a loss of momentum for the alt-right, though who knows, right? And another thing that would worry me about this possibility, this scenario, is that there might be a kind of a Ralph Nader moment. Those of you who are old enough to remember this will remember that in the 2000 election, the one in which George Bush beat Al Gore, although, if you're a leftist, he didn't beat him, he stole the election, whatever, right? But there were actually many people who ran also, but there was a guy called Ralph Nader for the Greens, and he carved off a few percent of the vote, and people basically said if those leftists hadn't voted for him, if they had voted for Al Gore instead, then Al Gore would have beaten George Bush. So those people who voted for Ralph Nader cost them the election and brought Bush into power. And a lot of people vowed that in 2004 they weren't going to vote for anyone but the Democratic candidate, simply because they didn't want a repeat of that. So they sort of said in 2000 we handed the devil the presidency. So I think there could be some sort of Ralph Nader moment for the GOP in that if Trump lost to Hillary and then Hillary were a complete, well, not if she were, she would be a complete train wreck, the GOP might actually get new life breathed into it, because they might say, well, see what happened, you split the vote, we had a Ralph Nader moment, and that's why Hillary got in, and she was horrible, and it's all your fault. And some people might say, yeah, you have a point, we really just like Hillary, yeah, we were silly, we shouldn't have voted for Trump, we should have just gone with a cardboard cutout. If only we'd done that, she wouldn't have got in, right? And we know that's a load of nonsense, right? But I think some people would be fooled by that. So I think this option wouldn't be so good for that reason. Just repeat after me: destroy the GOP, destroy the GOP, destroy the GOP, right? Whatever it takes to destroy the GOP. We can't give them the possibility of being raised from the dead in 2020, right? Pardon me. They need to be destroyed one way or another. And then option 3, so it's getting worse. Option 3, where Trump wouldn't even get the numbers to get the Republican candidacy. It has some advantages and some disadvantages. The primary disadvantage is that it might genuinely represent the alt-right losing momentum, because if he didn't have the numbers to even get the candidacy, then that could be really telling in and of itself. Or it might mean that people were just playing along with it, and then they got serious, when the primaries arrived, and went with the conservative, the cardboard cutout. So that's probably not a good thing if he falls off. The primary advantage, though, is that it would mean that the craziness under Hillary would begin sooner, and people would end up popping red pills left and right. And hopefully they would do that before the demographics, the culture, the economy, and so on were beyond hope. We might actually see some real craziness in 2020 if this were to happen. I don't know. It's hard to say. I think probably the alt-right probably wouldn't be fatally wounded by this. I think it would sort of dip down a little bit, but it would re-emerge stronger than ever. after, a year or two after Trump disappeared off the scene, as Hillary started to sort of work her magic as the Wicked Witch of the West. I think people would be red-pilled pretty quickly. But it's a sort of it's not an optimal scenario. It's quite risky as a proposition. And finally we get to 1.1 where Trump becomes president, and that's my least preferred option, and I've already explained why that is. So sort of, I'm getting towards the conclusion here. People need to understand that Trump is not enough. He's premature. There's not an unlimited time frame here. I mean, if this were a problem that would only sort of reach its terminal point at 100 years from now, then you could allow premature candidates, because there'd always be a chance of there'd always be a second chance or a third chance, right? But I really strongly suspect that America, as anything but Brazil, in every way, has maybe a generation remaining, at most. If America continues on its current course, demographically, economically, culturally, all the rest of it, and something big doesn't happen to completely overturn that, it can't be a little bit, it has to be the whole deal. If something big doesn't overturn that within the next 20 years, maybe considerably less, I think it's game over. I think America is basically Brazil of the North at that point. And I think that's true whether you come at this from the racial angle, the cultural angle, the economic angle, religious, you name it. I think that's true. I think America is in real trouble here. Serious trouble. I mean, obviously, that's why people like Trump, right? That's why they're latching onto him. Someone like him would have been largely inconceivable a very short time ago. So a lot of people recognize that there's a problem and they're latching onto him because of that. But I think the alt-right probably only has one shot at this, maybe two. It might have one plus a non sort of democratic, a non-electoral response, revolution of some form. I think America probably only has one shot at this. The alt-right only has one shot at this. If the alt-right managed to screw this up by being premature, that's it. I really think that's it. They need to. Their timing needs to be quite perfect, actually. And if they're premature and the alt-right gets discredited in a big way and somehow loses momentum, maybe it wouldn't. I mean, maybe Trump could be premature and Hillary could just go on her crazy path of destruction. Maybe it's inevitable that the alt-right will just keep going from strength to strength. I don't know. But if I am correct, and I really hope that I'm not, it's not because I don't like Trump as such. I mean, I don't think he goes far enough. But it's not that I don't like him. I just think that if the timing is wrong on this, if I'm correct about this, then I think you'd better start thinking about migrating to, I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, wherever. Whatever you think your next best option is outside of the US, if you're an American. If this is premature and it locks the alt-right out for a decade or so, 2 decades, and by then it's too late demographically, then you're going to have to start thinking like that, really. I know that's a bitter pill to swallow. And when I say locks the alt-right out, I don't just mean electorally. I mean, if a revolution doesn't come to fruition, if they're locked out in that way somehow, or if the momentum is lost in that way, then it's good night, and you'd better think of some sort of alternative. I know that's a bitter pill to swallow, that Hillary will win, and that she should win, and that you should hope that she wins. But that's how it is, We don't live in ordinary times. So those are my rather crazy thoughts about Donald Trump. I know some people will find them crazy, others will not. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for listening.